Hi, welcome to the video on making assumptions. As I mentioned in the previous video, the introduction on definitions and calculations, the definitions and the calculations aren't really the hard part. The hard part is making the assumptions that underlie these calculations, and so that's what we're going to talk about in this video. And let's start by talking about Fermi problem. Now we've done at least one Fermi problem earlier in the semester. And essentially, a Fermi problem it's named after Enrico Fermi, and the idea is to get practice making big estimates with limited data. And Fermi was famous for his ability to make these kinds of estimates. And so in physics and engineering, in these kinds of disciplines, these sorts of estimations are known as Fermi estimates or Fermi problems. The Fermi problem that I present to you is how many cases of COVID-19 will occur in the US before the number of active confirmed cases begins to decrease on a daily basis. And for future reference, I'm producing these slides on March 23rd, 2020. And obviously we have no idea what's going to happen, but we're going to talk about some different ways that people can go about making estimates. So first, let's think about the problem itself. So right now, the graphs for new cases in the US look something like what you see in that first graph. It's essentially going straight up, right, with no sign of decrease. And the question I'm posing is, when will they start to look like that second graph? When will they start to come back down as we move across the curve, right? When do the aggregate active cases start to decrease in the United States? Let's start with what we know. As of March 23rd, this data comes from Worldometers. There's 35,000 cases in the US. We've had 459 deaths and 184 people have recovered. And if we look at the graphs, we see that they really start to take off only about 12 days ago, and they're just skyrocketing now. So how can we predict what happens next? We can look at comparisons, we can build on estimates based on our own data, or we can do both. So let's look at some of the comparisons that are out there, and I'm going to move my video so you can see a little better. This is pretty interesting data put together by the University of Washington. This is, and this whole example is a pretty heavy example, so I hope I'm not discouraging you, but it is the reality that we're living in right now, is trying to understand what's happening. So we can look at, first of all, a pretty hopeful graph of Hubei, China. This is where Wuhan is located, and we can see that the active confirmed cases peaked February, looks like roughly February 20th or 22nd, somewhere in there. And then they started to decline. And they've actually been pretty close to zero for the last little while in terms of new cases. And so the active confirmed cases, people hopefully are recovering. In some cases, they're passing away. But the aggregate confirmed, or the active confirmed cases have been decreasing in pretty substantially. Now we can compare this to Italy. And we can see there's a little blip at the very end in the most recent where the aggregate confirmed, the active confirmed have leveled off. It's early to know whether that's meaningful or hopefully it's the first sign of change, where these active cases are maybe starting to decrease. We don't know yet, but generally the trend looks pretty frightening. Iran, the trend is going, essentially pretty. It's increasing pretty quickly. If we go back, or if we look at some more, we can look at South Korea. That's another sort of hopeful one. It hasn't decreased as much as Hubei province in China, but we do see at least the shift in trajectory of active confirmed cases have decreased pretty substantially. Japan's a more complex picture. It looks like there was some decrease in the active confirmed cases. Again, the yellow bar is what I'm looking at. but there's been some jumping around. It's not totally clear. It's not as clean as that first graph we looked at. And then Spain looks more similar to Italy, where we've got this big spike and maybe something happening, but way too early to really know for sure if it's actually going to level off or decrease. So as we look at these different comparisons, and there's lots more, and if you go to this website, hgis.uw.edu/virus, you can look at the data from around the world. And then the question becomes, which comparisons are meaningful? Which comparisons make the most sense? We can think about timing and geography. Obviously, Hubei, the introduction of the virus was a lot earlier, and we start to see that peak go up in January, end of January, early February is where we start to see cases really starting to shoot forward. Versus if we look back at the U.S., it wasn't really till beginning of March, so there's some timing differences there that give us maybe a window into the future. We can think about population. How many millions of people does the U.S. have versus Italy versus Spain versus Iran? What does the healthcare system look like? Obviously, a very, very different health regime in somewhere like the U.S. versus Iran. So are those meaningful comparisons? Maybe, maybe not. Type of government, could the U.S. come out and sort of impose draconian measures the same way China's been able to do? It's been very effective for fighting the virus, but we probably think about individual liberty differently in the U.S. and to what extent can we impose these sorts of measures? We're calling for them, but I think we've stopped short in terms of enforcement. And so to what degree is that a reasonable comparison? Culture, again, kind of this individualistic sort of American view versus more collectivist Asian view. Spatial geography, do people live in cities or rural areas? Even things like weather, there's been indications that the virus spreads more easily in colder climates, colder, drier climates, as compared to hotter, more humid areas. So we can look at all these factors and start to think about, okay, which comparisons make the most sense, or where do we think the U.S. might fall? So that's one approach to making these kinds of estimates is engaging in careful comparisons. Another thing we might do is build estimates based on our own data. So this data we're looking at is from the New York Times and Columbia University, and they provide a number of scenarios. So they say, what would this look like with no control measures? This is new cases per day. They believe that by May 21st, we'd be seeing 500,000 new cases per day with no control measures. With some control measures in place, we're looking at 300,000 per day. With severe control measures, they think there's actually some pretty good hope for keeping the new cases down substantially. These estimates, here's what it would look like, these different scenarios. Again, based on this data. So how did they make these kinds of estimates? What did they do? Well, this is quoting from the article. And here's the link to the article. And this is coronavirus could overwhelm U.S. without urgent actions. And this was March 20th. So 3 days ago from when I'm recording these slides, an eternity ago in the coronavirus timeline. And so essentially the Columbia researchers' model was based on records compiled by the New York Times. So data they collected. And then they also use these observations to infer key features of the outbreak. So these are some of the assumptions in their model. So each infected person has tended to infect about 2.2 other people. They estimate only 1 in 11 infections have been reported. They use these things to simulate the spread of the virus in the future. And they do note these estimates are imperfect, but they're consistent with available data. So they've taken available data and then built their models to make these kinds of estimates. So, again, we can kind of look at this, we can look at comparisons, and we can start to guess and think about what happens under different scenarios. And again, my hopes and prayers are that we'll do a good job containing this and friendly public service announcement. You're young, and even if you're really invincible, which you're not, by the way, but even if you are, people around you probably aren't. So stay safe, practice social distancing, do all those things that you can do to kind of make this curve look as much like that blue line as possible. So how can you build estimates for your own ventures? Well, it turns out very, very similar toolkit, right? You can use comparisons, look at other companies, generate your own data, collect survey data, interviews, MVP information, all those kinds of things. And of course, the answer is all of the above. Look at this from different angles. So what are the steps in the process? Well, we want to define the problem. We want to identify the information that we need. We want to identify what assumptions we're going to have to make for each piece of information. We're going to have to triangulate our assumptions, calculate, and then it's always helpful to kind of gut check at the end and say, does this seem reasonable? Why or why not? I've got to move my video again so that you can see my lovely tilapia up in the corner. So step one is define the problem. So let's say that for the sake of, again, a very simple example, but let's say that I'm launching a venture that will raise and sell tilapia. This is a kind of fish. They're for human consumption. And I'm going to sell them at the farmer's market. And I want to estimate the break even on my initial investment. So I need to identify the information that I need. Well, I know to calculate a break even, I'm going to need to know the amount of the initial investment. I'm going to need to know the cost of goods sold. And I'm going to need to know a sales price. Then I'm going to identify what assumptions I'll need to make for each piece of information. And I apologize, I got to kind of move this video around, but I want you to be able to see the text. So I need to think about the amount of my investment. And so what would go into that initial investment? I need to think really hard about every single thing I need to purchase, or rent or anything else. Land, tanks, equipment, licensing. I need stuff for temperature control because tilapia, grow faster in warm waters. I've got to make a really comprehensive list and walk through every potential cost. One way to do this is look at comparisons. Look at tilapia farms that are already out there. Look at what they've spent money on. I can also talk to experts. Maybe I want to call somebody who owns a tilapia farm and kind of walk through the initial investment. And then I can look at sales prices. I can look at market comparisons for fresh tilapia. So what are they selling? What's the price at other markets in other places? I got to think very carefully about the cost of goods sold. This is even probably more complicated, the initial investment. So let's say I purchase them as minnows. I've got to feed them. What are their mortality rates? So if I buy 100 minnows, how many are actually going to make it to market? What's the loss rate during travel? What are my travel costs? What's the cost of acquiring customer? What's time, labor? So again, I want to think very, very, very carefully about every single cost involved in, in the cost of goods sold. And let's say I gather this initial information. Well, at this point, I'm going to want to triangulate my assumptions. I'm going to look at, and let me just take one assumption here: sales price. And let's say that I look at comparative data. So I look at market comparisons for fresh tilapia in supermarkets, in farmers markets, all these places. But maybe to triangulate these numbers, I say, well, in my community, I'm going to be offering fresh tilapia. What are people willing to pay in Oxford, Ohio? And maybe just because they're paying this price in New York City doesn't mean that they'll be willing to pay it right here. So maybe I should do some survey data to kind of triangulate, make sure this estimate is reasonable. Once I've gone through all my assumptions carefully, I've triangulated them, then I can go ahead and calculate. So let's just say that I did all that work. I didn't for the sake of this video, but let's say I did, and let's say I came up with an initial investment price of $50,000, and I came up with an initial sales price of $6 a pound. I know my cost of goods sold is $3.50. Well, then the calculation is pretty straightforward, and I know that I can break even by selling 20,000 pounds of tilapia. Now I can run a gut check. I can say, well, is this reasonable? And is this reasonable on a couple levels? Do these numbers make sense? Does $50,000 seem like the right amount? Does the sales price seem to make sense? Do I have the capacity to actually produce 20,000 pounds of tilapia? How long is that going to take me? How does this compare with other tilapia businesses? How does this compare to returns in similar industries? All these things kind of help me go back and look and say, okay, is this a reasonable estimate? So here's some final thoughts on this topic. The key here is to be really thorough, walk through the entire process, think of every single assumption. This is where it's so helpful to talk to experts, even after you've made the calculations, and say, hey, can I walk through this with you? Does this make sense? Look really hard for comparisons, but don't be afraid to gather your own data. I think triangulation is always the answer. So surveys, you can use your minimum viable product to gather reactions and data, conduct interviews, especially with experts in this case. Think about good comparisons. Why are these comparisons the right one? Does it make sense to compare a tilapia farm with a shrimp farm? Why or why not? Does it make sense to compare it to a fine dining seafood place, the prices there, with a farmer's market or a supermarket? What's the same or different about these companies, and why does it make sense to use this comparison versus another one? So again, my invitation to you is to be really thorough, think very, very hard about your assumptions. The calculations are always pretty straightforward. It's the assumptions that are challenging. So do your best and come up with strong assumptions, and you'll have the opportunity to share those with your classmates, with me, to get good feedback and to prepare you in this journey. Good luck, and I will see you soon.